On a chilly autumn morning in the bustling city of New York, a young boy sat on a tattered blanket near the entrance of a sleek, high-rise office building. His clothes were worn, his hair unkempt, and his face carried a mix of innocence and resilience that only life on the streets could carve. He couldn't have been older than 10. His small hands clutched a paper cup, hoping for spare change from the endless stream of busy pedestrians rushing by. Most people didn't give him a second glance. They were too preoccupied with their own lives, their phones, their deadlines. Among the hurried crowd was a man who stood out, not because of his appearance, but because of his presence. He was tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, with polished shoes that clicked authoritatively on the pavement. He carried himself with a confidence that only comes from success built on years of hard work and sacrifice. This man was Robert Kingston, a self-made millionaire who had climbed from nothing to become one of the city's most powerful real estate developers. Every morning, Robert's black luxury car would pull up to the curb, and he would step out, briefcase in hand, ready to conquer another day. He walked past the boy without a glance, as if the child were invisible, just another fixture of the city's chaos. To Robert, the homeless boy was a reminder of the life he had left behind, a life of struggle, poverty, and pain he had worked so hard to escape. He didn't hate the boy, he just didn't see him. But the boy noticed Robert. He noticed how Robert's suit always looked perfect, how he walked with purpose, how he seemed untouchable. The boy didn't know why, but something about the man felt familiar. He couldn't explain it, but every time Robert walked past, the boy's chest tightened, as if some part of him recognized something his mind couldn't grasp. One day, as Robert exited his car and strode toward the building, the boy mustered the courage to speak. "Mister," he called out, his voice small and tentative. Robert barely slowed down. He had meetings to attend, deals to close. He couldn't waste time on street kids. "Sorry, I don't have any cash," he said over his shoulder, not even turning to look. The boy's face fell, but he wasn't surprised. He had learned not to expect much from the world. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he needed to talk to this man, that there was something important he needed to say. But what could a homeless boy possibly have to say to a millionaire? The days turned into weeks, and the boy watched Robert pass by every morning. Always the same routine, the same dismissal. The boy began to wonder if he was crazy for feeling this strange connection, for thinking that somehow this man mattered to him. But deep down, he knew there was something there, something he couldn't explain. Then one morning, everything changed. It was a grey, drizzly day, and the city was buzzing with activity as usual. Robert was running late, something that almost never happened. He was distracted, his phone glued to his ear as he barked orders to someone on the other end of the line. In his hurry, he didn't notice the puddle of water near the curb. His foot slipped, and he stumbled, dropping his briefcase. Papers spilled everywhere, scattering across the wet pavement. The boy saw it happen and, without thinking, leaped up to help. He scrambled to gather the papers, his small hands working quickly to save them from the rain. "Here, mister," he said, holding out the soggy documents. Robert looked down, his eyes finally meeting the boy's for the first time. For a brief moment, their gazes locked, and something unspoken passed between them. Robert hesitated, his usual air of indifference faltering. "Thanks," he muttered, taking the papers. His hand brushed the boy's, and he felt an inexplicable jolt, a flicker of something he couldn't quite place. Shaking it off, he straightened up, tucked the papers into his briefcase, and hurried inside the building, leaving the boy standing there in the drizzle. But that fleeting moment stuck with Robert. As he sat in his office later that day, staring out the window at the city below, he'd found himself thinking about the boy. Who was he? Why was he there every day? And why did Robert feel a strange, nagging pull in his chest whenever he thought about him? Meanwhile, the boy couldn't stop thinking about Robert either. He didn't know why he felt drawn to the man, why he felt this unshakable urge to talk to him, to connect with him. All he knew was that he had to find out. Neither of them could have guessed that their lives were about to collide in a way that would change everything. A secret buried in the past was about to come to light. A secret that would shatter Robert's carefully constructed world and reveal a truth neither of them could have ever imagined. And it all started with a boy on the sidewalk, a millionaire in a rush, and a moment neither of them could forget. Robert couldn't shake the boy from his mind. The moment their eyes met lingered with an unsettling intensity he couldn't explain. He wasn't someone who got distracted easily, especially not by things that didn't concern him. Yet, here he was, sitting in his lavish office, the city skyline stretching endlessly before him, with his thoughts fixated on a homeless kid. He tapped his pen against the polished mahogany desk, his brow furrowed. Maybe it was guilt. That had to be it. After all, he had been that kid once, a nobody, scraping by, invisible to the world. But Robert had clawed his way out, building an empire brick by brick with sheer determination. He didn't have time for distractions or misplaced sympathies. The world was tough. He had learned it the hard way. The boy would have to figure it out, just like he had. Still, something about the boy's face haunted him. There was a flicker of recognition, a familiarity he couldn't place. Robert tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but deep down, it gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't reach. The rain had stopped by the time Robert left the office that evening. The streets glistened under the glow of the city's lights, and the air smelled fresh, carrying a hint of something he couldn't name. As he approached the spot where the boy usually sat, Robert slowed down. The blanket was still there, but it was empty. For reasons he didn't understand, his chest tightened. He shook his head, frustrated with himself. "What are you doing, Robert?" He muttered under his breath. He had no business worrying about a kid he didn't know. Yet, as he got into his car and headed home, the boy's image stayed with him. Meanwhile, the boy, whose name was Sam, was huddled under a makeshift shelter a few blocks away. The rain had soaked through his blanket earlier, and he had moved to stay dry. His stomach growled, but he was used to hunger. Nights like these were tough, but they weren't new to him. He had been on his own for as long as he could remember, bouncing between foster homes and the streets. Trust didn't come easily to Sam, but for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt drawn to the man in the suit. There was something about him that felt important. Sam reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled photograph. It was old and faded, the edges worn from years of being handled. The picture showed a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. She was holding a baby that Sam knew was him. His mother had given him the photo before she disappeared, and it was the only thing he had left of her. He had spent years wondering what happened to her, why she left, and if she ever thought about him. The questions kept him awake at night, but the answers never came. Lately, though, Sam had started to wonder if his mother's disappearance was connected to something bigger. The man in the suit, Robert, looked vaguely familiar, like someone he had seen before. But where? Sam couldn't shake the feeling that Robert was more than just another stranger. He felt like a piece of the puzzle Sam had been trying to solve his whole life. The next morning, Sam was back in his usual spot, his blanket damp but better than nothing. He watched as the city came alive, people rushing to work, their faces a blur of indifference. Then, like clockwork, the black luxury car pulled up, and Robert stepped out. Sam's heart raced. He didn't know why he cared so much about this man, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that today was important. Robert walked toward the building, his pace brisk, his mind already on the day ahead. But as he neared Sam, he slowed down. He told himself it was just curiosity, nothing more. Still, he stopped and turned, his gaze meeting the boy's. "You're here again," Robert said, his tone more curious than dismissive. Sam nodded, unsure of what to say. He clutched the photograph in his pocket, the edges digging into his palm. Robert hesitated, then reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp bill. "Here," he said, holding it out. "Get something to eat." Sam stared at the money, but didn't take it. "I don't want your money," he said quietly. Robert raised an eyebrow of surprise. "Then what do you want?" Sam hesitated. He wanted to ask 100 questions, to tell Robert about the strange feeling he couldn't shake. but he didn't know how to say any of it. Instead, he blurted out, "Do you know someone named Lisa?" The question hit Robert like a punch to the gut. His hand froze, the bill still dangling between his fingers. Lisa. The name echoed in his mind, stirring memories he had buried long ago. Memories of a woman he had loved, a woman who had vanished from his life without explanation. A woman who, once upon a time, he had thought he would marry. Robert's throat tightened. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Sam flinched at the tone, but held his ground. I need to know if you know her." Robert's mind raced. It couldn't be a coincidence. The boy's face, the familiar pull he felt. It all started to make a horrible kind of sense. But no, it wasn't possible. Lisa had disappeared years ago. She wouldn't have had a child. Would she? Before Robert could respond, his phone buzzed, breaking the moment. He glanced at the screen. It was an important client. His instincts told him to ignore it, but his rational mind took over. He couldn't let his life be derailed by a random street kid and a name from his past. "I have to go," Robert said, shoving the bill into Sam's hand before walking away. But as he entered the building, his heart pounded in his chest. The boy's words had shaken something loose, and he knew he couldn't ignore it forever. Sam watched Robert disappear into the building, his hand clutching the bill tightly. He felt a mix of frustration and determination. He didn't know what was going on, but he was sure of one thing. The answers he had been searching for his whole life were somehow connected to Robert Kingston, and he wasn't going to stop until he found out the truth.